This
Well,
conference
good
will now be
afternoon.
recorded.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Hope everybody's well. I was just telling Derek and Byron I just got home from Alabama where I went on some personal business. So I wish I could have just stayed there and done this live, but I'm happy to be here with you. And so today, I bet nearly every one of you struggle with the issue of staffing. It's a national issue. It is almost a national crisis of being able to get and retain the staff that you need. So this is a little information that perhaps will help you look at your staff a little bit differently, begin to see their jobs a little bit differently, and maybe that also will help in your recruitment efforts. We'll also be talking about some training and some other things that help staff feel confident about their jobs and confidence in your job as something that will keep somebody on the job. So here I go. So the first slide, staff, our most important asset. If you thought you were nothing without your staff before, you haven't seen anything yet. The reason I did this slide is because I was thinking to myself about the experience I had with my own staff and how before when our agency was more facility-based, I always appreciated the staff and loved the staff and had a lot of contact with them. But everything changed sort of dramatically as we became more community-based, because the realization hit me that staff was even more important than I already thought they were, which was pretty important to start with. When you are often in the community and the staff and individuals are often in the community working or participating in meaningful activities in the community, that staff is often going to be out in the community by themselves with the individuals. So you're counting on them to do the best possible job, to use good judgment, and to show your agency well, to show the individuals well. So it is ever so important to get the right people and to support them and keep them, more important than it has been historically. So one of the things, excuse me, one of the things that I think is important, and it helps staff see themselves differently, and I think it helps them value their own work even more than they may do currently, and that is beginning to help them see themselves as change agents. It is actually the staff who are out in the community, whether that's an employment site or other locations, that are observed by the public. Most of us who are in administration, we do a lot of work and we work hard, but it's not us that the public sees out there with folks. So we are, really dependent on that staff to represent us well and also to understand their role as a change agent. So, it's my belief that we are in a civil rights movement for people with disabilities. And I've said in former webinars that, the reality is when a law passes like the civil rights law, that's one thing. That doesn't change the culture. It's a foundation upon which to build, and it helps secure people's rights from a legalistic perspective. But the change we're really looking for to help people really exercise their full civil rights is a cultural one. And by that I mean a public who sees people with disabilities differently, who gives up some of their preconceived notions of people with disabilities and begins to see them in a better, more positive light. It's going to be the staff that helps facilitate that. And we already know that cultural change occurs very slowly. It doesn't happen quickly. You'll get a law that'll pass like the civil rights laws in the mid-'60s, and yet, we're here so much later after that point in time, and there are those who would say people that civil rights legislation was meant to protect haven't fully achieved their rights. So it takes a while. And the truth of the matter is laws are not really what changes perceptions that people have. What changes perceptions people have of people is experience. So if you are an individual in the community who doesn't know people with intellectual and developmental disabilities very well, actually is suddenly working next to a person with an intellectual and developmental disability, or is in a volunteer situation with that person, and they begin to see them as an individual, not just one of those people, but an individual, Jim or Joan or Bob or whatever, not somebody from the arc of whatever, but an actual individual human being. And it's really the staff who are going to help facilitate that happening. They are in the best possible position to help change those perspectives and perceptions. And it's so important to help them understand that, because when it's framed like that, people really understand that indeed they are civil rights workers. That's what they do. And as a civil rights worker, they have certain responsibilities or things that they can do that will help forward the movement, or things they can do that will set the movement back. So some of the things I think that will help forward the movement is helping staff understand the importance of having expectations of people. We know how important it is in our own lives that people have set expectations for us. Probably nobody in this webinar would be where they were today if people had not had expectations for them. We rise to the high expectations set for us, or we fall to the bottom when there are no expectations. So when we get our staff to understand, that they should see people as able and capable rather than the opposite, that helps them fulfill their role as a civil rights worker. I think somebody needs to mute their phone, if you don't mind. Thank you. The other thing that staff can do, and you can help them see as part of their responsibility, is to have employment as a goal for everybody that they encounter, and understand that we may not realize that goal for everybody. We may not get to the Holy Grail, but if we don't have expectations of future employment for people, then we don't end up providing the preparation for them, and that ends up blocking that person's progress. And, we also need to help staff see that there's no absolute progression that someone has to go through in order to get a job. People could enter employment from any service that they're receiving. A person could be in residential services, and the residential staff see that indeed that person would benefit greatly from employment, help facilitate that person getting employment through a employment provider, or it could be someone in a day program who could not have to jump through hoops, but you could spot, this person really looks like they would benefit from work, and they go in directly from there. So it's important for staff, as they are seeing themselves as civil rights workers and people who are forwarding the rights of people with disabilities, to have these expectations, to provide this preparation, to understand that a person can enter services, from any kind of service they may be currently receiving, or from no service at all, and help people learn how to speak for themselves. I think that's one very important thing that staff need to understand about their job. It's not speaking for people with disabilities, it's helping them learn to speak for themselves and advocate for themselves. So this role of staff has changed. And I've worked in a facility, I've worked in a shelter workshop. I remember what my job was there. I remember how I perceived my job. And then I've also worked in community, and I remember how that changed. Once I was so much in the public eye with individuals, I understood my role was different. And that's what we need to help staff understand and embrace. And when they see their role in that very important way, as a person who could forward the civil rights of an entire population of people, that's very valuable. That's a very strong thing to use in recruitment and helping people understand the importance of their job. So, excuse me. First, we have to determine our staffing needs. So, it's interesting when I go to agencies who are in the transformation process and I run into staff who are afraid they're going to lose their jobs. If we think about it, the more individualized approaches we're using to employment and to day services require more staff, not fewer staff. And so there's very little chance that somebody's going to lose their job unless they decide it's not the kind of work they want to do. So, we need staff. There's no doubt about it. But some of the ways you determine how many staff you need, because obviously you need to know that, is anybody on the phone that I've worked with will know, and I suspect anyone who has worked with Tom will know, that we always advise people to do pilots. And part of the reason that we advise people to do pilots, whether that's a customized employment pilot, whether that's a community-based day pilot, is so that you can try things out and learn things. And part of what you're trying to learn is exactly how many people you're going to need in terms of staff. You don't know what your staff ratio, your staff to individual ratio might need to be. You got to get out there and try it, and then you can make that determination. And based on that, then you can move forward. And you also have to be thinking of how you're going to scale up. So in other words, if I had a pilot, a customized employment pilot, and I was using one staff for one person just to learn how to use that service, I would also need to be thinking about how am I going to scale this up once we get good at doing this and understand and get skilled with doing this. How are we going to need to scale up? Because what can happen is you can start piloting, you have success, people see that success, they start making referrals to you or requesting that kind of service, and you don't have staff prepared to get going. So part of the piloting aspect of this is to, get a vision for what's going to work and begin to figure out a timeline for how I'm going to scale this up and make sure that we are bringing staff on and training them in a timely way so we can do that scaling. Forecasting is difficult, and I've said this before, and we will actually talk about resource reallocation, I believe, next month. But most of us have traditionally budgeted based on history, what we had done last year and what we'd done the year before, and so what the trend has been in terms of referrals and hours of service and all of that. Now we're in a position where we're going to have to forecast some of that stuff without having a whole lot of experience, without having a whole lot of history under our belt. So that goes back to why it's important to do the piloting, begin to gather information and get experience that's going to help you forecast many things, but among those, your staffing needs. And then ultimately, you are looking at staff deployment. How are you using your staff? If you're maintaining some facility-based services and have other community-based employment and day services, how are you going to deploy your staff to cover all of those things, all of those different services that you're providing? So it's critically important to get a handle on how many people you're going to need in the future and by what schedule you're going to need to bring them in. So, you may start, as I was describing, with one staff and a CE pilot, but you can see that you want to do, 3 or 4 or 5 more people, over the course of the next few months. It can't be done by just one person. How many people do you need? When are those services going to be needed? How am I going to deploy the manpower I currently have? So it's not uncomplicated, but it is possible to figure out. We have to change the way we recruit because we are really looking at some different qualities and characteristics and competencies in people who are doing employment and other field-based work. And so we have to think very carefully about what it is we need from our staff. What will the person be doing? What skill do they need to do that? And how are we going to then attract those people? Because it's pretty obvious that our old strategies for attracting people to services provided in one kind of way would need to change in order to attract people who are providing services in another kind of way. So I think there's importance, and I believe later on in this PowerPoint I have some sample advertisements, but it's important to think about what you're wanting people as you're drafting your advertisements. What can you say in those advertisements that are going to attract the people that you need? And you also have to look at the interview process, because we can't continue to interview in the manner we interviewed before, because if I was interviewing you to ask about skills that you have or competence you have to work in my facility-based work, that might be one thing. But if I'm asking you to support somebody in the community, all day long without a lot of direct supervision, that's another ball game. So we have to really have an interview process that's going to capture both. And then obviously effective training is going to be very important with our new staff. I'll talk a little more extensively about all these things as we go along. One easy way to determine some of the skills and competencies that you may need in staff is to go to some of these sources that I've provided for you here. AL-APSE and ACRE and ODEP have websites which will actually literally list competencies that you need in people. So that's handy that someone has done that work for you. And so I do recommend that you take a look at some of these resources. But competencies and skills are one thing, and qualities and characteristics are another thing. And qualities and characteristics start being very much important as we're doing our community work, and that your thoughts about the qualities and characteristics that you are desiring in people and want to recruit for needs to be woven into everything, starting from the job descriptions, the advertisements, the interviews, the orientation process. Is very, very important to include that in what you're doing, because you want to attract people who have those qualities and characteristics. When they hear them reflected in everything they're reading and hearing and seeing with your agency, it helps reinforce, yes, this is the job for me. I am a person who has those qualities and characteristics, and this is a good match for me. So let's just to talk a second about the qualities and characteristics. It's an important thing for agencies to do, is to sit down and think about what a person is going to be doing and ask yourself, what qualities and characteristics do I need in a person for them to do that? So if you are a person who's supporting people directly in employment in the community, there's a certain kind of person who can do that better than others. And if someone's supporting individuals in the community, in community-based day services or pre-voc or employment exploration, they're in the community. Their job is interfacing with the community as well as supporting the individual. Have to think about what kind of person you want doing that particular job. And that is the beginning of identifying qualities and characteristics in people. So let's talk about what I mean by qualities and characteristics. So if my job as one of your staff is to, and part of my job is to help people connect to their community, which is a very important thing, then one of the things I want to know about my staff, or one of the qualities I'm looking for in staff, is whether they are a person who connects with others, connects with the community themselves. Because if they do, that's just a quality that person has, that have an ease and a desire to connect with others. That's a fantastic person to have on your staff with your individuals, again, helping them to be introduced and interact with folks in the community. We particularly are interested in people who are great communicators, because, again, your staff is out in the community. They're constantly interfacing with the community. If they're not a good communicator, then they're not going to have an advantage in being able to share with people is that what it is that they're doing. Because what I found is when my staff was in the community frequently supporting individuals, often people would come up, particularly if they were at places on a routine basis, and ask, tell me about what you're doing here. Can you help me understand, what this service is? And you want people who can express that and express it in a way that you would want them to express it. They also have to be people who will listen, and particularly to the individuals that they support. In employment, in any kind of community-based service, people are experiencing new things. They're deciding what they prefer and what they're interested in. We got to listen to what they're saying and pay attention and be responsive to what they are saying. We also obviously don't want people in the community representing your agency or the individuals whom they're supporting who don't have a professional appearance and don't present themselves well. It might be okay, although I frankly would question that, for someone to come into work in more casual attire. That's common. But if I'm going out and I'm interfacing with the public, attempting to support someone to get a job, it's incumbent upon me to look my very best, to be clean and neat and well dressed, and to be able to speak well. And without those things, first impressions count. And the reaction I might get with somebody for whom I'm asking for a job may not be very positive, because if I don't look good and I don't present myself well, they're certainly not going to be receptive to me bringing somebody else in. People need to be self-directed and well-organized, because often when you're doing community work, you are not being directly supervised face-to-face by a manager on a daily basis. You might see them in the AM or the PM, or you might not. You may go directly out to support people in employment, for example. So if you aren't organized and if you can't direct yourself, then it's going to be very difficult. You're going to not be as productive as you need to be, and you're likely not going to get the outcomes that you need. Not everybody in the whole wide world is good at self-direction. And so it's important to see, is this a person who, in the absence of direct, intense supervision, will they continue to carry on? Is it someone who can make good decisions? And again, I think we assume in our society that decision-making is an inherent skill. It is not. Decision-making is taught. We aren't born knowing how to make decisions. We have to be taught how to look at various options and choose among those options the best alternative to reach whatever outcome we're trying to achieve. So it's important for our folks in the community to be good decision makers, because inevitably they're going to have to make some decisions, and you're not going to be right there to guide them. You want to know that in that moment they will evaluate things appropriately and make good decisions. Self-starting, that you can't have a staff that's prompt dependent. You have to tell them every thing to do. Have to be a person who is a problem solver. I probably said to some of you on the phone when I met with you before, I think we're in the problem-solving business. I think we do, from sun up to sundown and beyond. If you're a residential provider, we solve problems all day long. And so if a person isn't good at evaluating things and being able to make decisions and solve problems, that's going to be difficult. They also need to be a good negotiator, because I frequently hear from people things like, well, I was in the community with some people and somebody said, that these individuals can't be here in this public place. Well, that is not true. ADA protects people's participation in any public any circumstance in which the public has access. But we don't want our staff throwing the ADA in people's faces. That's not helpful. They need to negotiate that, just as we need to negotiate the terms of a new job for an individual and the conditions. So the person has to not be a my way or the highway kind of person. They need not to be a person who just accepts the first thing that's offered, but able to understand how to negotiate things. You also need to have the ability to manage crises well. Inevitably, there will be crises in the community, and it would be foolish to think that that's not going to occur. No matter how well you plan, no matter how organized you are as an agency, there are crises that occur in the community that happen for circumstances often beyond your control. You want to know that that staff has the ability to manage well, not panic, in a crisis situation. I also want people to be innovative. And this sort of correlates with another item next to the bottom, ability to use teachable moments. When staff are in the community with people, there are millions of opportunities to teach and to train and to do creative things. But if staff aren't the kind of people who are able to think for themselves and see opportunities around them that aren't already prescribed, they're not going to be able to be innovative or take advantage of those teachable moments. And I sort of alluded to the next one before, having a strong work ethic. That sort of correlates with some of the other things. We need to know that in our absence of directly supervising them, they will carry on. And they will carry on because it's inherent in them, or they've been taught by their families and others around them, the importance of carrying your work out well and being loyal to the commitments you're making at work. So we really need that person who comes to the table with that work ethic, and it's a very difficult thing to teach someone as an adult. It's something that you've had ingrained in you as part of your upbringing. Also need to understand how to support people from what I call behind the scenes. What I mean by that is, I'm as guilty as anybody of this. Often if we're in the community with somebody, we go ahead of them. We're the first person to greet others. We're sort of standing there as the authority with others behind us because, and not for bad reasons, but we're afraid somebody will make a mistake or we're not sure they know how to do something. But we have to try to understand that, if you don't allow anybody to take any risk or to do things on their own, you'll never know if they could have done that because you have interceded before they had the opportunity. So we want people who can understand how to support somebody without dominating them. So those are just qualities and characteristics in folks that I've come up with, but I would advise all of you, within your agencies to sit down and ask yourself, what is it we're looking for in people? What would make a great staff who could really carry out the duties of the job we may be recruiting for? Obviously, once we have identified the skills and competencies and the qualities and characteristics, we need to begin to weave some of that into our job descriptions. I certainly hope that anyone who's on the phone or listens to this in the future is not failing to change their job descriptions for staff who have always been facility-based and are now being asked to do work in the community. That's a different job, and it needs to be reflected in a job description, a new job description. It's also helpful to begin to determine, and I think we've talked extensively about the importance of mission and values, but you want to communicate that mission and values to people over and over and over and weave it into all of your materials so they not only hear it one time in orientation, but they hear it constantly and it becomes clear to them, this is who we are as an agency. This is the mission we're trying to accomplish. I know that because it's imbued in every single thing within the agency. And an important aspect to writing the job summary, which most job descriptions have, is really to think about what the important words are that you want to use in that job description to really reflect the duties as well as the qualities and characteristics you hope that person is going to show. It is a grave error if you write a job description for a person who's going to be working in the community and don't highlight that fact. It's a critical thing for the person to know. The community is not for every staff person, and they need to understand the importance of being in the community. They need to understand the importance of teamwork, because inevitably, when you have a lot of staff in the community, they need each other. They often can depend upon each other, and they often work as teams because an enormous amount of flexibility is required when you're into employment in the community and other meaningful activities in the community. And what I mean by that is you could have someone who isn't working and suddenly they are working, or someone who is working and suddenly they aren't working, or someone who's working part-time and they need other supports other times of the day. And so all of those things are going to cause schedule changes. They're going to cause people to be with other people than they're accustomed to being with. And if all the staff is just rigid and it's like, no, you said I was going to do this and don't change up on me, that's going to be a problem. Because these are very dynamic services that change all the time, and the staff really have to change, be able to change with that, work with their coworkers, and be people who can be incredibly flexible. And with regard to employment in particular, if you are hiring people as employment specialists, job coaches, or whatever term you may be using, if you're not saying in that job description that their job really has to be very flexible, because they're going to work the hours the individuals that they're assigned to work. And if that's a Saturday or if that's an evening, that's when they should be working. And I see a lot of agencies fall into the trap of, well, all the staff's accustomed to working to, 8 to 4 or whatever, and so I'm going to try to get all my jobs from 8 to 4 Monday through Friday so I don't rock any boats here. Well, the jobs that people want and the jobs that may match that person the best may not be available during those hours. And so we have to have staff who understand that their job has to flex so that they can support people at the times they're really needed. Do not fail, if you don't hear anything else I have to say, do not fail to include that flexibility in that job description, because you don't want that person to suddenly feel like they're surprised at hearing that they're working different hours than regular program hours. And you certainly don't want to hire anybody on board who states up front, I won't work anything but program hours, because you're going to quickly get in a box, because you can't get everybody a job between 9 or 8 to 4 or whatever. It's going to be a broader range of times of days and days of the week, and we're going to have to be responsive to that. I wrote here a little bit of took a couple of items, out of a job description, a sample job description that I had written previously, and this is actually out of the job summary. Generally, in a job description, you start off with something that just sort of summarizes, what it is that the job involves. So you can see here, how it's beginning, even in this wording in the job description, is beginning to reflect to the person what it is, not only that they're going to be doing, but the values and the beliefs of the agency. So when the job description says something like working with assigned individuals, staffs, and other members of circles of support to identify, jobs based on interests, skills, talents, etc., and it talks about community employment, think about what's already been expressed in terms of values. You immediately are talking about working with the individual and staff in circles of support. That's already suggesting, you're not alone. You're a part of a team, and a person-centered team that's going to have other people, and that's involved, and that's what is appropriate. It also is immediately talking about securing jobs that reflect interests, skills, talents. And so rather than saying, you're just going to get jobs for people, you're not going to just get jobs for people. You're going to get jobs that reflect interests, talents, skills, etc. If you look at the gray box, it begins to talk about the importance of being able, particularly for those who work in employment, being able to work well with employers. And historically, we've not done the best possible job in this regard. We have been so focused on getting people into jobs that we've come off a little desperate, and we have not been concerned about whether that job indeed is going to help that business be successful. Well, that's a mistake, because eventually that business, if its bottom line is affected, negatively, that person's going to go bye-bye. So we have to be understanding of what is important to the business, what they need, and what will help support them. And if you look at this wording, it helps people to understand that, even just within the language of the job summary. And obviously then at the bottom green box, we are expounding further on what we expect, what our values and our mission reflect, making sound matches between the work aspirations of the individual and the personnel needs of the employer that make satisfactory outcomes for both parties. So in a simple job summary, we have reflected so many values and expectations for the staff of how we'll do what we'll do, that it's an excellent start for that person's understanding of what their position is or will be. Here's just some questions. We're not going to discuss them, but for you to think about, and the questions are, have you thought, or what are some important qualities and characteristics as well as skills and abilities that you're going to need in your community-based staff? And then the second question is, have you either already changed or begun to change or plan to change job descriptions based on that information to reflect those qualities, characteristics, skills, and abilities? All right. Let's talk a little bit about recruitment. And I started off by talking about what a hard place we are in right now in our field, and people in many other fields are in a hard place in terms of recruitment, because we have a high level of employment right now, and so people have many more choices in the kinds of jobs that they select. You are never, you meaning our industry, we're never going to be able to compete on a dollar basis. So in other words, many people are going to beat us in terms of the amount of the hourly wage they're able to offer. And I don't anticipate that that's going to change too dramatically anytime in the future. So as we are recruiting, we need to write some pretty catchy recruitment ads and use some very effective strategies, because we're up against other recruiters who have dollars that we don't have to put on the table. The other aspect of that is that in order to attract the right people, you have to begin to reflect the values of the agency within those advertisements. We have to use really thoughtful language in those advertisements, because if we just go with the same old, that we need somebody to work with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, blah, 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 and we start our ads like that, we're probably going to miss a whole slew of people that would be great for this job. And by the way, it is way easier to teach someone how to work with people with disabilities than to teach them to have the qualities and characteristics in their personality and in their personal ethic that you need. So it's really critically important to get the right people in there. You can teach them, you can train them the technical stuff. It's hard to teach an adult things like responsibility, work ethic, and those kinds of things. So, again, you're trying to reflect the values from the get-go in the ad, so you're really trying to imbue those ads with the qualities and characteristics you're looking for in the person, because that ad that reflects those is going to attract that kind of person. And obviously in the ads, you need to let the person, know what it is you would be doing. What would the outcome be of what you would be doing? And often we don't include that. So you see an ad and it's to work with people with disabilities, but it's not entirely clear what you'd be trying to accomplish. We want to say from the moment you look at the ad, this is what you would be trying to accomplish. So then I, who am reading the ad, can decide, is that something I would like to do? Are those outcomes things I would like to work towards achieving for a person? Just be very conscious that the orientation of staff doesn't begin on orientation day. The orientation of staff starts long before that in the recruitment process, because the language you use, how you present the person's job, is part of communicating to them what their future is going to be, what kind of agency it is, and what the expectations of that person may be. So I put in here a little sample recruitment ad, and this may be longer than you may want to use, and if you're using certain internet platforms, it may be lengthy, but I think or I hope, I should say, that it makes the point that this, where I have the writing in blue, is those are qualities and characteristics. So this ad starts from the very get-go saying we need a motivated self-starter. Those aren't skills, those are qualities and characteristics. With a strong work ethic. Again, you're saying from the beginning, you need to be enthusiastic, you need to be able to work independently, you need to have good skills in terms of being self-directive and a strong work ethic. In addition, you're saying right off the bat, you need good organizational skills, because you know that person who is often in the community by themselves supporting individuals needs to be a very organized person, or you're going to run into difficulty. With and a professional appearance, we've already talked about the importance of that. And this person, again, see how many different things we're reflecting in here from the qualities and characteristics list. Problem solving, enjoys people, because if I'm an employment staff person and I don't enjoy people and develop relationships reasonably easy, then the job is harder for me. So if we can get that person who knows they are this type of person who's being described here attracted to us, that's a great boon to us. So this goes on to say, to assist job seekers with an array of interests and abilities to find suitable employment. Notice that I haven't said people with disabilities yet, because that's not the important thing. These are the important things, that the person will be able to do these, will have these qualities and characteristics, and will be able to develop relationships with employers to address their workforce needs, and to identify, on the other hand, with job seekers, and note again, I have not yet said with disabilities, job seekers to identify work interests, their preferences, and their skills. And we'd say that it'd be great if the person has experience working in the community, business community, and with job seekers with diverse skills, abilities, and barriers to community employment. The important thing is not that the people have disabilities. The important thing is that people have barriers to employment. So it could be a person with IDDD, it could be a person with mental health challenges, it could be a person who has been on benefits and out of work for a long time, and therefore has barriers getting back into work based on skill deficits or whatever. But, working with people with disabilities doesn't tell me anything. This tells me a lot about what kind of person you're looking for, what I'm going to be doing, and what the outcomes we're looking for may be. We need to think about how you're really marketing. I mean, I don't know that people think about it this way, but actually in seeking people to fulfill the jobs in your agency, you're actually marketing to people, to those prospective employees. So you have to really be thinking as you are advertising and sending a message to prospective employees, whether are you highlighting the attributes of the job? Hopefully in the former advertisement, that highlights some of the attributes. You're going to be, learning about employer needs. You're going to be matching people. That's helping people understand what's going to be expected from them. It's also important to reflect to the person some benefits for working for your agency. If you again think back to the former ad, if you are looking for people who are going to have to be fairly independent, then you want to attract people who are motivated self-starters, because that's already saying, oh, I looked at this ad, I liked that language, this is who I am, and one of the benefits for working with this agency is I'm going to have a certain measure of independence. I'm going to have a certain measure of having to be self-directed. This is not going to be a job, where I'm going to be under someone's thumb all the time. And you also want to create a sense of excitement. If I just have an ad, that says, I need someone to support people with disabilities in their jobs, that's not very attractive. I mean, if you're interested in that, great. But what if I'm saying, motivated self-starter, develop relationships with people? All of those terms in that language creates a sense of, this sounds exciting, I would like to do that. It's also important to think about how you're messaging to different groups of people, or different, first to identify, are there different markets to whom you are making your pitch, but are you then communicating in style and language in a way that indeed it will appeal to that particular market? And this is what I mean by that. Millennials, to some degree, but especially with Gen Zers, and I'm sure Gen X, have been identified as having an interest in a couple of important things that work very well for us. One is autonomy. And we are looking for people who can be autonomous and can work very independently. If we already know that Gen Zers like that, then our ads need to hit upon that, because they're going to see that motivated self-starter or whatever and say immediately, oh, that looks like I would have autonomy. That sounds interesting. What is this? Another market you might appeal to are people who are retired. So maybe you need some part-time people to work on the weekends or some odd hours, not full-time. And so you're trying to say, well, who is it out there to whom this would appeal? Well, I ostensibly retired a long time ago, but I didn't really, because I work part-time as a consultant. And many of my colleagues who are my same age, who have supposedly retired, work. They work shorter hours and part-time, but they want to do something. And so how are we pitching to that group of people? How are we making sure that our messages are getting to them? And similarly to parents with school-age kids, because if you have jobs that can offer the flexibility of someone leaving, say, at 3 o'clock, every day because they have kids that they've got to pick up from school or be home for when they get home from school, you may have a whole slew of people that you could appeal to in the community for whom that job would perfectly fit. Just a quick aside on that, I told some of you at least, with whom I've worked. In our agency, we allow people who were working in day services at the end of the day to go home as soon as their individuals left, but they had another hour of work that they could do anywhere they wanted to do it, and that was getting their paperwork up to date. Think about it. If you were a parent, you needed to be home by 3:30 for your kids getting off the school bus, and your individual, left you wherever you are at 3. You could get home by 3:30. You could take care of the kids, and you could get those notes done by tomorrow morning. But you've got this flexibility built in here that allows you to both take care of your family and be able to do this job. We sometimes are rigid with how we do things, and we might say, oh, no, that person has to come, stay at the office or come to the office when the individuals leave and get all the paperwork done. But you've just cut yourself out of the possibility of an entire population of people you could recruit. You also need to think about people from particular communities and who are also those who are diverse language speakers, because if you have a population of individuals who, or you might be able to create a referral base of people who were, say, Spanish speaking or something, and you could find personnel, that speak Spanish. That's going to broaden your horizons tremendously, in addition to serving the people well, because they're served and their families are served by someone who can communicate with them in a way that people who did not speak that language could not do. And what I mean by people from particular communities, sometimes I've just happened to tap into a vein of people I might not have thought before who might be of a particular cultural community. I know that I've in the D.C. area, and we have a lot of immigrants in Alabama too. I might have hired somebody. I had an individual who was a Filipino, that I was serving, and so I was seeking someone from that culture and speaking that language so that I could serve that person well. But suddenly I realized there are a lot of English-speaking people in that particular cultural community who are eager to have jobs. Okay, now I might actually put an ad, in a newspaper that appeals to that particular cultural group. I might advertise and put out flyers at a church that appeals to that particular group. I'm specifically targeting that group because I know there are people within it who have the skills to do this work, but they might not just naturally be aware of or attracted to the work. We have to cultivate them. And also specialty staff. And what I mean by that is to some degree what I was saying. That specialty staff may be someone who speaks a particular language. It may be someone who knows sign language. It may be someone who is particularly good at supporting people with complex behavioral challenges. So, we can't just blanketly market and think that we are going to get to some of these groups that we desperately need to get to. And that takes me to modes and methods. So, I've talked to lots of you, and I know that you are tapping into some of the internet recruitment sites, and I say, great, I'm glad that you're doing that. Those sites are very helpful, and they're being very effective for folks right now. But there's all kinds of social media that you can use, and given that we, at this point, are appealing generally to a younger population of people, that's how they communicate. They don't look in the newspaper. They don't know what a newspaper is if it's not digital. And so if we are advertising using a method through a mode that is not one that is accessible to the populations we're looking at, we're kind of wasting our time. So we have to be doing things like using the Craigslist of the world, Facebook, and other such alternatives, as well as making sure you're using your own website well to advertise that you have positions if someone is researching and happens to come to your website. You have to use things like job boards, and job boards are now more electronic than paper, but there are paper ones as well, and you should be using both, and those are generally at your universities, your community colleges, and other sites where people may be receiving some kind of training. You can and should be doing things like using coworker referral process, and by that I mean that if I recommend Derek, for a job with you, and after 90 days Derek is still on board and doing a good job, I get a couple of $100. And that's somebody may say, oh, that sounds like a lot of money. The amount of money it takes for you to recruit someone is significant. If you can do that for a couple $100, you're doing great. So think about how you are mining your own staff to see if they know about people who may be interested. There's also obviously networking. Who do your friends know? Do any of your families that you support individuals from? Do they know people? Are you talking about this at church and other civic, religious or civic entities? Are you using every alternative that you can find for marketing? And then don't be afraid to step outside the box either. One time at our agency, we actually saw someone that was just this incredibly great person at providing customer service in a shoe store, and we pursued that individual to come into our field and to take one of the jobs because he had everything in terms of the qualities and characteristics that we needed. And once again, we knew we could teach him how to work with people with disabilities and do the job, but he already was coming with the whole full package in terms of his personality. And also there's, it's advantageous to have relationships with higher education institutions who have individuals who may be graduating in a couple of years, but you are communicating to them early what it will be that you are looking for in people. This can even happen at the high school level. Some high schools have developed tracks for certain professions, and you can work with them to help them understand what it is will be needed in a person, and then have a relationship with them in terms of helping those people explore you as one of the options post-training. So here I have the interview process also becomes very important because you need to know that you are asking the kinds of questions that are going to get at what you need to get at. And that's not necessarily, do you know how to do a behavior plan? Have you worked with people with disabilities, for years on end? Sometimes we're hiring people who don't have a lot of experience, but that, again, as I've said numerous times, is not necessarily the most important thing. What's important is to learn about that staff. So I might ask questions like these listed here. Tell me about yourself. What do you do in your spare time? Are you connected to your community, and what does that look like? Do you like to meet people, or are you a person who would rather stay behind the scenes and not have that kind of interaction? Are you a person who works more independently, or are you someone who's not comfortable with that and would rather have direct supervision? So, and then finally some questions. If you have worked with job seekers before, tell me about that. What did that look like? What did you do? These questions are different than the old style questions in that they're trying to surface, again, who you are, what kind of person you are, what kind of personality do you have? Are you going to be that kind of person who can take on that task of helping to change the perception of people with disabilities in society? It's always important to keep data, And, if you are not doing some of this, I certainly recommend that you do. And part of why you want to know the demographics of your staff, you want to know who have you been attracting, or how old is your staff population. Are you looking at a whole bunch of staff who have been working for you 20, 30 years and they're looking to retire? And also, when you are looking at those demographics, you may get some insight, or you may just directly ask them, how did you come to apply here? Through, what was it that attracted you to this field or this job? And then that strategy has some power to it. We also need to look at things like how long are our staff staying, and when they leave, why are they leaving? And understanding that that will give us a lot of insight. If we have people who are staying a long time and when they leave, it's because they're retiring, or, they got a great promotion or a great opportunity someplace else, but they're not leaving because they're unhappy with your company and how they are treated there. It's also important, to have an HR database, and hopefully you have HR people and you do have these databases where you can have some of this information stored. And some stuff you can get at through your applications. Always on my applications, I ask, how did you learn about this job? Because that's then going to give me a piece of data I need, in terms of understanding what strategies are most effective. And we all know about exit interviews, which is an interview you do with someone, when they're leaving. Generally, we don't do it with someone when we fire them, but when they leave up their own accord. That's an opportunity to say, tell me about your experience here. Why are you going elsewhere? What could we do better to support staff? Very important information. But there's also something called a stay interview, and that's just not waiting until the person's leaving, but asking people who have a substantial longevity, what is it that keeps you here? What are we doing right is essentially what you're saying. What are we doing right in keeping folks on board? You also, I'm a great believer in satisfaction surveys for staff because we want to know what we're doing right with staff and what we could do better. In our agency, we annually surveyed people. We used the same survey year after year so we could compare data over years and see what was changing. We asked, they were confidential, but we wanted to know what roles people were fulfilling, because we might have one particular role that was unhappy compared to other folks. What's going on there? Let's try to understand that. And people like to be asked how satisfied they are, but what they do not like is to be asked how satisfied they are, respond to that, and then have you ignore what they had to say. So if you institute something like an annual staff satisfaction survey, you equally need to institute the process you're going to use to respond the information that staff has given you. So if you're surveying your staff and 90% of them are not happy with something, you would be very foolish not to try to figure out how to address that thing, because that's the thing that may cause you to lose staff or be unable to attract additional staff. So again, some quick questions to consider, just asking you, what you're doing now and how successful you are using that particular strategy or technique, and then reflecting a little bit on how you can change that if it's not very successful, or even if it is successful, how could you even enhance that and make it better? Staff is, there are statistics and studies that will tell you, and I think I have this elsewhere, but I'll say it here as well, that staff who feel competent in their jobs, meaning they know what they're doing and they're confident that they're doing it well, stay longer. One of the things that makes people leave jobs is feeling, I haven't been trained, I don't really understand what I'm supposed to do, and then being criticized for not doing well, but I don't have the training that will help me do well. So that is very discouraging for staff, and often they'll leave as a result of that. So if we have staff training that really helps train the staff extremely well on the competencies that they are going to need to have, particularly that they're going to need to have before they work alone in the community. That's first going to make sure that the service is provided well and the individuals get the best quality that they can, but it's also going to help that staff feel good. I'm going out in the community. I know I'm going to be working alone with people. I'm not going to have a supervisor right there all the time, but I feel confident with all this good training and support I've gotten that I can do this job. It's also, as I mentioned earlier, I think in the orientation and training of staff, helping them understand the importance of their job, helping them feel good about what they're going to be doing and the contribution that they're going to be offering to society. They're not just doing a workaday job. They are doing a job that can change the perception that society has of a very specific group of people. That is a very powerful position to be in. And it doesn't make up for the dollars you don't make entirely. But when one can lay one's head down on the pillow at night, knowing that you are doing something so profound as changing the perception society holds, is a pretty magnificent thing and can hold someone in good stead, even if there are other things that they could do that would be more lucrative, but would not give them as much satisfaction. Obviously, when we are doing training with people, and particularly if we are in an employment first mode, focusing on the importance of work and the impact that work has on a person's life and the impact that has on their position in society are very important things to emphasize in training, and ensuring that the folks understand that their job is not to go out and control everything in the environment, but sometimes you're stepping back a little bit and your job is facilitating the development of relationships between community members or employers and people with disabilities. That is how one creates natural support. And that is what we would like to see, the creation of more natural supports rather than always having paid supports, which doesn't mean paid supports go away, but it would be good to have more focus there. These are just some things in staff training that are important to think about. You need to train all of your staff. If you have a big focus on employment and you also have a day program and a residential program, all of that staff needs to understand some of the same things. Everybody needs to understand what constitutes best practice. Everybody needs to understand the agency's philosophy, what employment means, what meaningful community integration means, and what their role is as a change agent. The employment staff have more specific things, specifics about community integrated employment and customized employment, and MCI means meaningful community involvement or meaningful community integration. But even if I'm not doing that, I need to understand it because in my mind, meaningful community involvement leads to good opportunities to be successful in employment. Those who are doing the meaningful community involvement, the day programs and those kinds of things, need to understand what they're doing has a connection to the future employment of that person. All of these things are connected. It's not like we do disparate services that have nothing to do with each other. They all overlap, and we all need to understand what everybody's doing, if not in the minute detail, in general, and how they fit together, and how our role helps make that happen. It's getting more and more important to do cross-training, because as people are in the community doing things like working, but they're working part-time, and other times of the day they need other kinds of support. Sometimes we're not going to physically be able to make the change of staff. And so if I'm an employment person and I've been supporting somebody for, 6 hours, and they have, 1 more hour a day that they would get community-based day services, it makes more sense that that employment staff would be trained to fulfill that last hour of service than necessarily driving someone, 2 staff across town to try to get, day staff there or whatever. So some thinking about cross-training is important as services become more and more individualized. And it is very important when we have staff who are community-based to make sure that they're competent before they go out there. And one way to do that is to have seasoned staff who have already shown their competencies, mentoring new staff who are just learning for a while so that they are learning from peers how the job is done. And they're out in the community with folks, but not alone for a while. They're out there with a mentor. This is just from a PowerPoint that we used in our agency with all staff, irrespective of what their particular position was, including, clerks and, the HR folks and the front desk and everybody, is, how, when we're trying to figure out how to help people have a full and happy life in their community, the question is, what makes a meaningful life? And we would begin all of our orientations, again, irrespective of the position, getting people to think about this very question, what makes a meaningful life? Because that then set the foundation for all of the subsequent training that we were going to offer to that staff, and it put everybody on a level playing field in terms of the first information that they were getting when they came on board. So this PowerPoint was done in the very first day of employment with every single person in the agency. This is what I was saying. I thought I had this later in the PowerPoint, so bear with me here. Studies do show that connection between feeling competent and staying on the job, reminding ourselves that people are out of direct supervision often when we're in employment and other community-based services. So they have to be competent, and you have to be confident that they know what they're doing. And as I said earlier, repeat the values and beliefs of the agency so everybody, no matter what their particular role is, understands this is what we're moving towards. This is the goal. No matter what, whether I'm a clerk in the payroll office or I'm an employment specialist in the community, we are all ultimately aiming towards the same goal. We may have different responsibilities, but we're all aiming towards the same goal. A unified agency where everybody understands what you're trying to accomplish is a successful agency. Just a few words on training availability. Obviously, there are national conferences, and it's something to think about is the fact that usually administrative people go to these conferences, and I think that's good because I think administrators need to understand what the trends are. But we also need to be more thoughtful about how can we get people who are in the direct line, directly providing support to individuals in the community. How are we getting them involved? Need to take advantage of obviously the national conferences, but also your regional and statewide conferences, and you have at least a couple every year. It's also important for states to go for things like federal grants that'll offer them funding for statewide training opportunities, which is what the state of Alabama has done in their relationship with ODEP and the Supported Employment Leadership Network. Done a great job. I give a lot of credit for that to Byron. In many states, DD councils are providing dollars for funding for targeted kinds of statewide training. I work in several states that realize that there's a big need for, say, customized employment training, and so the state itself will try, or the DD Council itself will use some of their funds for doing some of that training. I think it's interesting when I see collaborative training among agencies, and something to really, really think about, particularly those of you who may be in a close geography. Say you wanted a training in some particular thing, and it was not going to be offered for 6 more months, by the state or some other entity. I have seen in Maryland is a very good example where 4 agencies came together and brought some customized employment training into the state that had extra field-based mentoring in that training, more than could be supplied by the statewide training. They used their own dollars and put them together to bring those trainers in, because they could share the cost of travel, they could share the cost of lodging, they could share the cost of whatever fees were being charged. In addition to that, those 4 agencies then had a bond. They had staff who experienced this training together. They now can kind of lean on each other a little bit, and maybe even have a coalition of staff who have been through that training, who are going to have a problem-solving group or something like that. There are many options online for training. This is my bias. I don't know if there's any studies on this or anything, but my personal bias is, depending exclusively on online training would not be a good idea. In our agency, we set up in our office a room with several computers, PCs. People did online training, but we always had a monitor in the room. And by monitor, I mean a knowledgeable staff person that if anybody in the room had any questions, they could stop what they were doing online and explain that, talk to the person. So having that physical presence made me feel better about the ability of people to have more individualized training. It is going to be important to think about capacity for internal training in agencies in Alabama at some point in time. And this is what I mean by that. In the 2 states that I have some contact with, I do this in Michigan and I have colleagues that do this in Tennessee, they have started a train the trainer training cycle for both anchor training and for customized employment training. Now, those states have been providing those services for a while in their provider community, so they have a good deal of expertise. But if you have trainers within your own agency that can provide on-demand training for your staff, to think of the advantages of that. You don't have to wait 6 months. You could do it sooner than later. It helps you establish experts in your agency. You can craft the training to infuse it with your own agency's values and philosophy. And you can possibly even then get someone who's an internal trainer who could provide training to other agencies because they become so expert, and sometimes that can even bring you revenue. And it's just, if you take this strategy, it's just important to recognize that staff who have that level of expertise and are becoming these kinds of trainers as really valued within your agency and within your communities. So some things just to consider is, how are you getting your training currently? Is it sufficient? And could you work with some other agencies to get better access to quality training? None of this will matter if you don't support your staff well, particularly your field-based staff. So it's important that you have managers who are skilled in the specific jobs that the staff are doing. And what I mean by this is, for example, customized employment, I think, is more complex, or requires a more complex set of skills than maybe we had before in, say, just regular support employment. But if a manager has never seen or been a part of a training in customized employment and doesn't understand what goes into it, and they're trying to supervise someone who's doing that job, they won't know how to do it properly. And so it's very important. They don't have to have the same, absolute level of skill, but they certainly need to have an understanding of what goes into that job so that they can give the best support. They really have to be with the staff in the community. You can't sit in your office and have your staff in the field feeling supported. You can't fail to bring that staff together frequently, because staff that's in the field often are not seeing other staff for long periods of time. You don't want to allow them to develop a sense of alienation, so you have to go to them You have to bring them together frequently and cultivate among them a sense of, even though you're out here most of the time, you still belong to the agency, and we still care about you. We consider you, one of our major assets. Just because you're out there doesn't mean we don't care about you. Often I would have staff, or almost always I would have staff meetings in the community because I was trying to model field-based inclusion. If I'm saying to you it's important for people to be in the community and you're out in the community, I need to come out in the community too and do things like staff meetings with folks. I used to do staff meetings in libraries and rec centers and church basements and things like that, again, to model that community inclusion aspect. And you need to focus on things like problem solving. Are there some issues that are coming up? Can we talk as a group and see if we can address that? It should be a place, where sometimes you're doing training, but you're always reinforcing people. You're allowing people to talk and get help, and just feel that common cause among yourself and your colleagues. And it's also a great place to say, Derek, I keep using you. Derek, you got, a great job for John this week. Hallelujah. Let's all congratulate Derek for his success. That's very reinforcing to Derek to be among his peers and to hear that kind of reinforcement. You also need to link performance to competencies, and what I mean by that is particularly when you are doing performance evaluations, they really need to be based on competencies and outcomes that people are achieving. You need to make sure that, as I said earlier, the job descriptions reflect the job and include the competencies, that you are providing training that is helping the person do their job. You are reviewing and rewarding people for the skills they're displaying and the outcomes they're achieving. What I believe is important, and what I did in my agency, is we used observations to help assess for evaluation of staff. And really what we were doing is we weren't so much evaluating the staff, we were evaluating the effectiveness of the training we were providing. So I think, through those observations, we were tying the skills that were taught in the training to the competencies that the staff was displaying that were also reflected in the job description. And by doing that, we were not being punitive. We were associating the observation of the person displaying the skills to the effectiveness of the training they had received. And if they weren't able to display the competencies, the first strategy was to say, what additional training can we do, or what advice can we give you, or can we pair you with a person who has these competencies? What can we do? What strategies can we employ to help you be better? Rather than you're bad, you're doing a bad job, you're not a good person, which is absolutely to be avoided. And this put more of the onus back on us to say, are we doing everything we can to help this person be successful? So again, here's a few little questions to consider. I'm not even going to read these other than to point out the last one, which is to say, are you making sure that when you're looking at job descriptions, you're also looking at that manager's job description and making sure they understand, as your staff are moving to support people in employment and other things in the community, is that new job description saying that? Is it helping them understand so they shouldn't be in the office all the time, so they aren't suddenly surprised they're supposed to be out in the field? Teamwork is another important thing. I alluded to it earlier. This work environment is dynamic. A lot of things happen. Opportunities come up. Schedules change. Everything is moving all the time. The best way to respond to that kind of dynamic environment is to have teamwork and have teams that form around common sets of outcomes and will work together to solve problems, share responsibilities, be creative. Teamwork is essential in this kind of work. And here's just a few characteristics. People have to be flexible and cooperative. They have to be customer service oriented and be able to work cooperatively with other people to make sure no matter what, that job gets done. That person gets the support that they need. It's, teams just don't form out of nothing. There are ways to help create teams, and there are ways to help support teams. And you have to do some training, or we always did, in group facilitation and teamwork for people who participated in teams. And we really had to allow teams to have a little, let the leash off of the teams a little bit and allow them to come up with some creative things. And we had to reward their good work and their good ideas. We also had to say, these are the things that this team can decide independently, but here's the things that you may not decide independently. These have to come to your supervisor for discussion. Because if you don't do that, and then they go make a decision about something that you didn't want them to, but you never told them that they shouldn't do that, then they feel punished for doing what they thought they were supposed to do. We have to develop a tolerance for some minor mistakes. We don't want to make, huge mistakes where people get hurt or anything like that. But if we're not making mistakes, we're not trying. And so we have to be more tolerant of some mistakes folks will make. So just to wrap it up quickly, we need to reframe the job, seeing people or helping people see themselves as change agents. We need to determine how many staff we need and what kind. We need to determine the competencies as well as the qualities and characteristics. We have to have a recruitment plan that is thoughtful and effective. We have to have a support strategy for supporting your field-based staff and effective strategies for training and evaluating people. And I have to have a huge focus on teamwork. So with that, I will conclude. And if there are any questions and people want to unmute for them, I would be happy to take them.